The bright studio lights shone down on the polished wooden floor of Tonight with Jimmy Carson, one of the most watched late-night talk shows in America. The air buzzed with excitement as the live audience settled into their seats after a commercial break. Camera operators moved quietly around the edges of the set, while makeup artists made last-minute touches on the host's face. Jimmy Carson, with his trademark blue suit and perfectly styled hair, flashed his famous smile as the floor director counted down with her fingers. 3, 2, 1. Welcome back to the show, everyone. Jimmy's voice boomed through the studio and the audience broke into applause. What a night we're having. If you're just joining us, we've been talking with one of Hollywood's biggest stars, the Fresh Prince, himself Will Smith. The camera panned to Will, who sat comfortably on the cream-colored couch, one arm stretched along the back, his legs crossed casually at the knee. He wore a tailored burgundy suit that popped against his skin tone, with a crisp white shirt underneath. No tie. Will had always preferred the relaxed look. He flashed his famous grin and waved at the renewed applause from the audience. Will's here promoting his new movie Redemption Line, which opens this Friday. Jimmy continued, holding up a poster for the camera. And folks, I've seen it, and it's absolutely mind-blowing. The stunts alone are worth the price of admission. Thanks, Jimmy. Will nodded, his voice smooth and confident. You know we put everything into this one. I was doing 2-a-day workouts. For 6 months before we even started filming, my trainer had me lifting weights that I didn't even know existed. The audience laughed appreciatively. Will had always been good at working a crowd, making them feel like they were all just hanging out together, sharing stories. But we're not done with the star power tonight, Jimmy said, turning toward the entrance on the far side of the stage. Our next guest is a man who needs no introduction, but I'm going to give him one anyway. He's the star of the John Wick franchise, the Matrix series, and his new film Midnight Horizon is breaking box office records as we speak. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the one, the only Keanu Reeves. The studio erupted. Fans jumped to their feet, their cheers nearly drowning out the house band's rendition of the theme song from The Matrix. From the side entrance, Keanu emerged, walking with his distinctive gait, somewhere between a stroll and a stride. Unlike Will's bold fashion statement, Keanu had opted for his usual understated elegance: black jeans, black boots, and a simple, charcoal gray blazer over a black t-shirt. His hair fell to his shoulders in dark waves, and a hint of stubble shadowed his jaw. Keanu waved somewhat shyly at the crowd, never quite comfortable with the level of adoration he received. He made his way across the stage, shaking Jimmy's hand firmly before turning to Will. The two actors shared a brief handshake and a half-hug that looked friendly enough, though keen-eyed viewers might have noticed it lacked the warmth of true friends greeting each other. Keanu Reeves, everybody, Jimmy said as the applause finally died down enough for him to be heard. Thanks so much for being here. Take a seat. Take a seat. Keanu settled into the other end of the couch, leaving a cushion's width between himself and Will. He sat forward slightly, elbows resting on his knees, hands clasped loosely in front of him. His characteristic listening pose. So, we just watched a clip from Midnight Horizon, Jimmy said, turning his attention to Keanu. That motorcycle chase through the streets of Tokyo was absolutely incredible. How much of that was actually you? Before Keanu could answer, Will let out a small laugh. It wasn't exactly mocking, but it wasn't entirely good-natured either. What's funny? Jimmy asked, turning to Will with a curious smile. Oh, nothing, Will said, waving his hand dismissively. Just thinking about how movies work these days. Go ahead, Keanu. Keanu glanced briefly at Will, one eyebrow slightly raised before returning his attention to Jimmy. Well, I did a fair amount of the riding myself. I've been on bikes most of my life, so the basics come naturally. But the more dangerous stunts, the big jumps, the slide under the truck, that was all Rob Patrick, my stunt double. He's amazing. Rob Patrick, Will repeated the name, nodding slowly. See, that's interesting to me. When I was coming up in the business, we were expected to do as much as humanly possible ourselves. It was a point of pride. A slight murmur ran through the audience. This wasn't the typical light-hearted banter they were used to seeing on the show. Jimmy's eyes widened slightly, but his professional instincts kicked in. Well, Both of your films have some pretty spectacular action sequences, he said, trying to steer the conversation back to safer waters. Keanu, Midnight Horizon continues the tradition of groundbreaking visual effects that we've seen in your previous work. Can you tell us a bit about the new technology they used? Keanu began to explain, his voice measured and thoughtful as always. The team developed this new camera rig that could— You know what I always wonder? Will interrupted, shifting in his seat to face Keanu more directly. I wonder if audiences can tell the difference between an actor who's really in there, doing the work, feeling every emotion for real, and someone who's, let's say, more comfortable letting others handle the heavy lifting. The studio grew noticeably quieter. A few uncomfortable coughs could be heard from the audience. Jimmy's smile remained fixed in place, but panic flashed behind his eyes. I mean, take that scene in your movie, Will continued, gesturing toward the screen where Keanu's clip had played moments before. The one where your character finds out his brother died. I watched that and I kept thinking, is he really connecting with that emotion? Is he going to those dark places inside himself that an actor needs to visit? The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. The camera operator zoomed in on Keanu's face, capturing his calm, unreadable expression. The director frantically signaled to Jimmy from offstage. They needed to cut to commercial, and soon. Keanu's fingers tightened slightly where his hands were clasped, the only visible sign that Will's words had affected him at all. The audience was now completely silent, the collective tension almost palpable as they waited for his response. In the control room, producers were frantically discussing whether to cut away. We can't let this turn into a fight, one said, reaching for the button that would cue the commercials. Wait, said another, eyes fixed on the monitor showing Keanu's face. Look at him, he's about to say something. Jimmy Carson cleared his throat, prepared to jump in and save the moment with a joke, a distraction, anything to break the uncomfortable silence that had settled over the studio like a heavy blanket. But before he could speak, Keanu straightened, slightly in his seat. His expression remained calm, but something shifted in his eyes. Not anger, but something more thoughtful. The floor director, clipboard clutched to her chest, held her breath along with everyone else in the studio. The red light on camera 3 blinked steadily, capturing every nuance of the moment. In the front row, a young woman with glasses leaned forward in her seat, not wanting to miss whatever was about to happen. Will Smith, perhaps realizing he had crossed a line, adjusted his position on the couch and forced a laugh that didn't quite reach his eyes. Just actors talking shop, you know how it is, he said, attempting to backtrack. But it was too late. Everyone was waiting to hear what Keanu would say. The seconds stretched out like minutes as Keanu gathered his thoughts. The entire studio hung on the moment, the silence broken only by the faint hum of the air conditioning and the barely audible whispers of the production staff behind the cameras. Whatever Keanu was about to say, it was clear that no one, not Jimmy, not the audience, and certainly not Will Smith, was prepared for it. The tension in the studio hung heavy like a storm cloud about to burst. The audience members exchanged glances, some leaning over to whisper to their neighbors. Will shifted his weight on the couch, his smile still in place but his eyes revealing a hint of uncertainty. He hadn't expected his comments to land quite so heavily. Look, I'm just saying, Will continued, attempting to soften his previous remarks without actually backing down. In my new film, there's this scene where I'm hanging off the side of a building 50 stories up. Real fear, real adrenaline. You can't fake that kind of raw emotion. The camera picks up on what's genuine. Jimmy Carson's eyes darted between his two guests, his usual confident demeanor slipping slightly as he realized this interview was veering into unpredictable territory. Well, different actors have different approaches, he began, hoping to smooth things over. Absolutely, Will cut in. And I respect all approaches. I'm just a big believer in putting yourself all the way into a role. No shortcuts. He turned, to face Keanu directly now. Your Midnight Horizon character, he's supposed to be this tough guy who never shows fear, right? I'm curious, how do you tap into that if you're letting someone else handle the scary stuff? A woman in the third row covered her mouth with her hand, A young man near the back whispered, "Oh snap," to his friend. The floor manager made a slicing motion across her throat, signaling to Jimmy that they should cut to commercial, but curiosity kept the host from acting on the suggestion. What would Keanu say? Keanu remained still, his face contemplative rather than offended. He looked down at his hands for a moment, then up at Will. The silence stretched another beat before he finally spoke. "You know, I've been thinking a lot lately about what acting really is," he said, his voice soft yet somehow filling the room. "When I started out, I thought it was all about me, my performance, my emotions, my physical commitment to the role." The audience leaned forward collectively, straining to catch every word. This wasn't the defensive response they'd expected. "The thing is," Keanu continued, "the longer I've been in this business, the more I've realized that filmmaking is one of the most collaborative art forms in the world." He straightened up slightly, his gaze steady. "Take that building scene you mentioned in your film. How many people helped make that moment possible? The riggers who ensured your safety, the camera operators who had to hang right there with you, the director who guided your performance, the composer who later added music to enhance the tension." Will's smile faltered slightly. This wasn't the direction he'd anticipated. "When I work with my stunt double, Rob," Keanu went on, "I don't see it as taking a shortcut. I see it as honoring his expertise and passion. Rob has trained his entire life to perform these incredible physical feats safely. He's an artist in his own right." In the control room, the producer who had been about to cut to commercial lowered her hand. "Let this play out," she murmured to her team. "This is gold." Jimmy Carson, sensing the shift in energy, relaxed slightly in his chair. The interview had taken an unexpected turn, but it wasn't the train wreck he'd feared. Instead, there was something compelling happening, a real conversation about craft between two very different artists. "But doesn't that distance you from the character's experience?" Will pressed, though his tone had lost some of its edge. "If you're not actually feeling the wind in your face when you're hanging off that building, how do you communicate that fear to the audience?" A stagehand paused, while adjusting a light, curious to hear Keanu's answer. Even the makeup artist who'd been waiting in the wings to do touch-ups during the next commercial break stood still, listening. Keanu nodded thoughtfully, considering the question. "When I was younger, I might have agreed with you," he admitted. "But I've learned that empathy and imagination are just as powerful tools for an actor as physical experience." He leaned forward slightly, warming to the subject. "In Midnight Horizon, there's a scene where my character learns his brother has been killed. I didn't need to actually lose someone to access that emotion. Instead, I drew on a memory from when I was 19 and got a call that my friend had been in an accident. That feeling, that hollow pit in your stomach, the way the world suddenly stops making sense. I can recall that without having to live through fresh tragedy each time." Something in Keanu's words seemed to resonate with the audience. A middle-aged woman in the fifth row nodded emphatically. An older man near the front removed his glasses to wipe his eyes. "As for the physical stuff," Keanu continued, "when Rob does a stunt for me, we talk about it afterward. He tells me how it felt. The pressure of the wind, the disorientation, during a role, the impact. Then I can incorporate those details into my performance during the close-ups." Will was listening now, his initial attempt to shame seemingly forgotten as genuine professional curiosity took over. "So, you're saying the authenticity comes from the collaboration, not just from one person's experience?" "Exactly," Keanu nodded. "And there's something else too. When I let Rob handle the most dangerous stunts, it's not just about safety. It's about respect for his craft. It would be arrogant of me to think I could do what he does with just a few weeks of training, when he's dedicated his life to it." Jimmy, sensing an opportunity to steer the conversation into more positive territory, jumped in. "That's fascinating. You know, Will, your dance background must give you an advantage with some of the physical aspects of your roles, right?" "Sure," Will acknowledged, his demeanor notably warmer now. "I've always been comfortable with movement, but what Keanu's saying makes sense. When I worked with the boxing coaches for the Champion's Heart movie, I wasn't trying to become a real boxer in 6 months. I was learning enough to honor the sport while telling a story. The atmosphere in the studio had transformed. What had begun as an uncomfortable attempt to put one actor on the spot had evolved into a thoughtful discussion about craft. The audience, initially tense with secondhand embarrassment, now watched with genuine interest. "You mentioned imagination earlier," Jimmy said to Keanu. "How do you balance that with the technical aspects of a role?" "That's where the real magic happens," Keanu replied, a rare hint of animation entering his typically reserved demeanor. "In Midnight Horizon, we had this scene in a rainstorm. The technical side was dealing with the cold water, hitting my marks, making sure my dialogue could be heard over the rain machines. But imagination is what makes you forget all that. It lets you truly believe you're this character in this moment, fighting for something that matters deeply." A young aspiring actor in the audience pulled out his phone and started taking notes, not wanting to forget these insights. Will nodded slowly, absorbing Keanu's words. "You know, my acting coach used to tell me something similar. He'd say, technical. Skill gets you on set, but imagination and empathy get you into the character's soul." "Exactly," Keanu agreed. "And that's available to all of us regardless of how we approach the physical aspects of a role." In the back of the studio, one of the production assistants whispered to another, "I thought they were going to fight, but this is actually better." Jimmy looked at his cards, then set them aside. The scheduled questions seemed trivial now compared to the genuine exchange unfolding before him. This was why people watched his show, for authentic moments between interesting people. "Let me ask you both something," he said. "What's the biggest misconception people have about acting?" The question hung in the air. The camera panned from Jimmy to Will to Keanu, capturing the thoughtful expression on each man's face as they considered their answers. The attempt to shame had transformed into something much more valuable, a window into how two very different artists approached their craft. And as Keanu took a breath to answer, the audience sat in perfect silence, completely engrossed in the conversation. Whatever he was about to say, it was clear that everyone in the room, including Will Smith, was eager to hear it. "The biggest misconception about acting," Keanu began, his voice thoughtful, "is that it's about pretending. It's actually about finding truth even in made-up situations." Will nodded slowly, genuinely interested now. "That's good. That's really good." Jimmy sensed the shift in the conversation and decided to dig deeper. "Can you explain what you mean by that, Keanu?" "Well," Keanu said, settling back slightly on the couch, "when people hear acting, they often think we're just playing make-believe. But the best performances happen when you find something real inside yourself that connects to the character. Even in a movie with impossible scenarios, like dodging bullets in slow motion, the emotions have to come from somewhere authentic." The studio lights seemed to dim slightly, creating a more intimate atmosphere as the conversation deepened. Or perhaps it was just that everyone in the room was so focused on the exchange that the surroundings faded away naturally. "I actually agree with that completely," Will said, his initial combativeness now replaced with professional respect. "My early roles were more about charm and charisma, you know, just being a bigger version of myself. It wasn't until I tackled more challenging parts that I really understood what you're talking about, finding that emotional truth." A young woman in the audience nudged her boyfriend and whispered, "See? They're not fighting. This is way better." Jimmy leaned forward, sensing a golden television moment unfolding. "It sounds like you both approach the craft differently in some ways, but you share this fundamental philosophy about truth in performance. Different roads, same destination," Will offered with a genuine smile. Keanu nodded in agreement. The tension that had filled the studio just minutes earlier had transformed into something else entirely, a masterclass in acting philosophy that no one had expected. "Let me ask you something else," Will said, turning more fully toward Keanu. "That scene in Midnight Horizon where you're surrounded by those mercenaries in the warehouse, there must have been, 20 stunt performers in that sequence?" 23, Keanu confirmed. "How do you keep track of all that choreography while still staying in character?" "I've always found that challenging." The audience watched in fascination as the interview transformed before their eyes. What had begun as Will attempting to shame Keanu had evolved into two professionals comparing notes, like master chefs discussing techniques. That's a great question, Keanu replied, visibly warming to the topic. For me, it's about preparation. We rehearsed that warehouse scene for 3 weeks before filming. When the movements become muscle memory, your mind is free to focus on the character's emotional state. The camera caught a close-up of Keanu's hands as he gestured to explain his point. His movements were precise but natural, like everything else about him. It's like playing jazz, he continued. You learn the scales and chord progressions so thoroughly that when it's time to improvise, you don't have to think about the technical elements anymore. An older man in the second row, wearing a worn leather jacket, nodded vigorously. He turned to his companion and whispered something that made them both smile. That's exactly how I think about it too, Will said, his eyes lighting up. When I was preparing for the courthouse monologue in Justice Line, I must have practiced those words 1,000 times, not just to memorize them, but so they'd flow naturally even when I was focused on the emotions. Jimmy glanced at his producer, who was giving him an enthusiastic thumbs up from beyond the cameras. This unexpected turn was television gold, authentic, insightful, and completely unpredictable. You know what's funny? Will continued. The public sees the finished product and thinks, oh, that looked easy. They don't see the months of preparation, the countless takes, the entire team working behind the scenes, the invisible art. Keanu agreed quietly. A stagehand who'd been adjusting a light froze in place, not wanting to miss what was being said. Even the makeup artist who'd been waiting for the commercial break to do touch-ups stood motionless, completely absorbed in the conversation. Speaking of the team behind the scenes, Jimmy interjected. Keanu, you've developed quite a reputation for your relationships with crew members. There are all these stories about you buying gifts for stunt teams and remembering everyone's names. Keanu looked down modestly. It's just common courtesy. A film set is like a small village. Everyone's contribution matters. The best sets I've worked on have been the ones where there's a sense of community. Will's expression changed slightly, becoming more reflective. You know, that's something I've been thinking about more in recent years. Earlier in my career, I was so focused on my performance that I sometimes lost sight of that community aspect. The older I get, the more I appreciate what everyone brings to the table. The camera caught Jimmy's reaction, a look of pleasant surprise at how the conversation had evolved. No one had expected this level of candor and professional respect. When the segment began, there was this lighting technician on Midnight Horizon, Keanu said, leaning forward slightly. Tom had been in the industry for 40 years. During a night shoot, I noticed him adjusting a backlight in a way I hadn't seen before. When I asked him about it, he explained how that particular technique created a subtle halo effect that would emphasize my character's isolation in that scene. It was this small detail that most viewers would never consciously notice, but it added to the emotional impact. That's the kind of artistry that happens all around us on set. A young woman in the front row, clearly an aspiring filmmaker based on her intense focus, pulled out her phone and began typing notes, not wanting to forget this insight. That reminds me, Will said. On Redemption Line, our costume designer had sewn these tiny imperfections into my character's suit. Almost invisible repairs that told the story of what he'd been through before the movie even began. No camera would ever catch those details, but they helped me understand who this man was. The audience sat in rapt attention, many leaning forward in their seats. This wasn't the shallow celebrity banter they were used to. It was a genuine glimpse into the craft of two masters. It sounds like you both value these hidden details, Jimmy observed. The things the audience might not directly see but somehow feel. Exactly, Keanu nodded. Film is this fascinating medium where hundreds of small, thoughtful choices combine to create a single experience for the viewer. Each department contributes their own form of storytelling. It's like building a house, Will added. The audience sees the finished structure, but they don't see the foundation, the wiring, the plumbing, all these essential elements that make the house function. A production assistant whispered to the floor manager, "We should be going to commercial, but nobody wants to cut this conversation short." The floor manager nodded in agreement and made a subtle gesture to Jimmy, indicating they'd adjust the schedule to allow this segment to run longer than planned. Some moments were too valuable to interrupt. "I have to ask," Jimmy said, "since we're talking about collaboration, how do you handle it when there's a disagreement on set? When your vision for a scene differs from the director's, for instance?" Will and Keanu exchanged a look, a moment of silent recognition between two men who had undoubtedly faced this situation countless times throughout their careers. "That's where respect comes in," Keanu said after a thoughtful pause. "I always try to remember that the director is seeing the whole picture in a way that I can't from within my character. But you also have to advocate for what you believe in," Will added. "Some of the best scenes I've been part of came from those creative tensions, where different perspectives pushed us to find something better than what any one person had imagined." The studio lights caught the subtle nod of agreement from Keanu. There was something happening here that transcended the typical talk show formula, a genuine exchange between artists that offered a window into their world. In the control room, the executive producer whispered to her assistant, "Cancel the next segment. Let this breathe. This is why people still watch live television." As the conversation continued to unfold, the audience remained completely engrossed. The initial attempt at public shaming had transformed into something far more meaningful, a masterclass in artistic collaboration and respect. And Jimmy Carson, recognizing the rare magic unfolding on his stage, set aside his prepared questions entirely. Some conversations deserved the space to find their own path. This was clearly one of them. The studio had fallen into a comfortable rhythm, the initial awkwardness now completely forgotten. Jimmy Carson glanced at his notes, then set them aside. The conversation had taken on a life of its own, flowing in directions far more interesting than his pre-planned questions. "You both have been in the industry for decades now," Jimmy said. "How has your approach to selecting roles changed over time?" Will leaned back slightly, his posture relaxed. "Man, when I was starting out, I just wanted to be in the room, you know? Any role was a good role. Then there was a phase where it was all about what would make the biggest splash, what would top the box office." He paused, glancing briefly at Keanu. "But these days I find myself drawn to stories that say something meaningful. Parts that scare me a little because I'm not sure I can pull them off. That's where the real growth happens." A woman in her 50s, sitting near the middle of the audience, nodded in agreement. She turned to her companion and whispered something that made them both smile knowingly. Keanu listened attentively, his expression thoughtful. "I've had a similar journey," he said. "Early on, you take what comes your way because you need to work to build experience. Over time, you start to recognize the types of stories that resonate with you personally." Jimmy leaned forward. "Can you give us an example?" "There was this small independent film I did a few years back," Keanu said. "No big budget, no fancy effects, just a simple story about a man reconnecting with his estranged daughter. It barely made a blip at the box office, but I still get letters from people who say it helped them reach out to their own family members. That kind of impact means more to me now than it would have when I was younger." The camera caught Will's reaction, a look of genuine respect. That's what it's all about in the end, isn't it? Making something that matters to someone else. In the control room, the producer whispered to her assistant, "Are you getting this? This is gold." The assistant nodded, equally captivated by the unexpectedly profound exchange. "Speaking of impact," Jimmy said, "you've both been part of hugely influential franchises that have shaped pop culture. How do you handle the weight of fan expectations when returning to beloved characters?" Will chuckled. "Oh man, social media has definitely changed that game. Nowadays, everybody's got an opinion and they're not shy about sharing it." "Before you even shoot a single scene," Keanu added with a small smile. "Exactly," Will agreed. "But you know what I've learned? You can't create from a place of fear. If you're constantly worried about disappointing people, you'll end up with something safe but soulless." A young man in a Matrix t-shirt in the audience nodded vigorously, clearly invested in the conversation. "For me," Keanu said, "it's about respecting what came before while still being open to where the character might go next. The fans care because they've formed a genuine connection with these stories. That's actually beautiful," when you think about it. Jimmy's eyes lit up. This was the kind of authentic moment talk show hosts dream of. No artifice, no pre-rehearsed anecdotes, just real conversation between two artists who had clearly given these matters serious thought. Let's talk about the physical demands of your roles, Jimmy suggested. You're both known for action sequences. Will, you mentioned earlier about hanging off buildings. Keanu, your fight choreography has literally changed how action scenes are filmed in Hollywood. How do you prepare for those physically demanding roles as you've gotten older? Will laughed. Well, I'm definitely not recovering as quickly as I used to, that's for sure. The audience chuckled appreciatively. An older gentleman in the front row patted his own knee as if in solidarity with aging joints. The approach has to evolve. Will continued more seriously. In my 20s, I could just show up and do whatever they asked. Now there's a lot more preparation, specific training, proper warm-ups, knowing when to use padding. It's about being smarter about the physical work. Keanu nodded in agreement. I've found that consistency matters more than intensity now, maintaining a baseline of strength and flexibility year-round rather than trying to transform in a few weeks before filming. A fitness trainer in the audience pulled out her phone, quietly making notes. But there's also something to be said for the wisdom that comes with experience, Keanu added. When you're younger, you might rely more on raw physical ability. As you gain experience, you learn how to be more efficient with movement, how to tell the story with less exertion but more precision. Will pointed at Keanu enthusiastically. That's it exactly. It's about working smarter, not harder, understanding exactly what the camera needs to see and focusing your energy there. Jimmy noticed how the two men were now building on each other's thoughts. The initial tension completely transformed into mutual professional respect. One thing I've noticed watching both your careers, Jimmy said, is how you've managed to balance commercial success with artistic credibility. That's not easy to maintain over decades in Hollywood. Will considered this for a moment. It's a constant balancing act. The big studio films often give you the platform and the resources to reach a wide audience, but the smaller, more personal projects feed your soul as an artist. They inform each other, Keanu added. The lessons you learn making an independent film with limited resources can help you bring more authenticity to a bigger production, and the technical skills you develop on major films can elevate what you're able to achieve in smaller ones. The studio lights caught a hint of emotion in Will's eyes. You know what's funny? When I started out, I thought success meant being the biggest star, having my name above the title. Now I measure it differently. By the variety of stories I've been able to tell, the collaborators I've been blessed to work with, the moments when someone tells me a film helped them through a tough time. A woman in the back row dabbed at her eyes, moved by the sincerity in Will's voice. That perspective shift is so valuable, Keanu agreed. In this industry, it's easy to get caught up in the metrics, box office numbers, awards, reviews. But at the end of the day, it's about the human connection. Did this story matter to someone? Did it make them feel less alone? Jimmy looked between his two guests, clearly moved by the turn the conversation had taken. I have to say, this is not where I thought this interview was going when we started, he admitted with a smile. The audience laughed, the sound warm and appreciative. Sometimes the unexpected turns are the best ones, Will said, glancing at Keanu with newfound respect. Like when a scene takes on a life of its own during filming and you discover something you never could have planned. Keanu nodded, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. The happy accidents. A camera operator who had been focused intently on capturing the subtle expressions of both actors shared a knowing look with the floor director. They'd both witnessed what rarely happens on talk shows, a moment of genuine connection. Before we wrap up this segment, Jimmy said, I'm curious, what's something about the film industry that would surprise most people? Will and Keanu exchanged a glance, each waiting for the other to go first. For me, Will finally said, it's how ordinary most of the work is. People see the glamour of premieres, but they don't see the hours of sitting around between takes, the countless script revisions, the early call times when everyone's just trying to stay awake and remember their lines. The catering, Keanu added with unexpected humor. Everyone on set gets very passionate about the quality of the food. The audience laughed, delighted by this glimpse behind the curtain. But more seriously, Keanu continued, I think people might be surprised by how vulnerable you have to be. There's this perception that acting is about confidence, about being larger than life. But the most powerful moments often come from being willing to show your uncertainties, your flaws, your humanity. Will nodded slowly. That's the truth, right? There. The willingness to be seen, really seen, with all your imperfections. That's the heart of it. As the conversation continued to unfold, no one in the studio was checking the time. The producers had long since abandoned the planned schedule, recognizing that they were witnessing something special, a genuine exchange between two artists that had begun as an attempt to shame and had transformed into a masterclass in mutual respect and insight. And for the audience members lucky enough to be present, it was a reminder of why live television still mattered in a world of carefully edited content. Because sometimes, the most meaningful moments are the ones no one saw coming. We need to wrap up soon, Jimmy said, glancing at the floor director who was making subtle gestures about the time. But before we do, I have one last question for both of you. What's the best advice you've ever received about this business? Will took a moment to consider, his expression thoughtful. The best advice I ever got was from an old director on one of my first big movie sets. He pulled me aside after I'd been stressing about a scene and said, Remember, we're not saving lives here, we're telling stories. So have fun with it. Will smiled at the memory. It sounds simple, but it changed everything for me. Whenever I start taking myself too seriously, I remember that. An older woman in the audience nodded, as if recognizing the wisdom in those words. And you, Keanu? Jimmy asked. I was struggling with a character early in my career, Keanu replied, his voice quiet but clear. I couldn't find my way into his perspective. A veteran actor on set told me, stop trying to be interesting and start being interested. He meant that I was so focused on how I would come across that I wasn't truly curious about the character's life and choices. That shifted everything for me. The studio sat in appreciative silence, absorbing the simple but profound insight. A young aspiring actor in the third row mouthed the words to himself, committing them to memory. I love that, Will said with genuine admiration. Being interested rather than trying to be interesting. That applies to life beyond acting too, doesn't it? Keanu nodded, a small smile playing at the corner of his mouth. Jimmy looked at his watch reluctantly. I wish we had more time, but we need to take a break. Will Smith, Keanu Reeves, thank you both for one of the most memorable conversations we've ever had on this show. The audience erupted into applause, many rising to their feet. What had begun as an awkward, tense exchange had transformed into something rare and valuable, an authentic glimpse into the craft and philosophy of two master performers. As the applause continued, Will turned to Keanu and extended his hand. I owe you an apology, he said, just loudly enough for the microphones to pick up. I came in with some assumptions that weren't fair. Keanu clasped his hand warmly. No apology needed. This turned into a good conversation. The director signaled for the commercial break, and the red lights on the cameras blinked off. The studio audience continued their enthusiastic applause as the house band began to play. Jimmy leaned over to thank his guests again as makeup artists rushed in for touch-ups before the next segment. But the story didn't end there. What the viewers at home didn't see was what happened during the commercial break. As the studio bustled with activity, crew members adjusting lights, production assistants conferring about the next segment, Will and Keanu remained on the couch, continuing their conversation away from the rolling cameras. Seriously, Will said, leaning in, so Keanu could hear him over the band and the audience chatter. That wasn't cool of me earlier. I came in with this whole plan to make a point, and it was ego talking. Keanu shook his head slightly. We all have those moments. The question is what we do next. A production assistant hovering nearby tried to appear busy with her clipboard, all while straining to overhear this unexpected moment of humility from one of Hollywood's biggest stars. You know, Will continued, my kids have been telling me for years that I need to listen more and talk less. Guess they were right. He laughed, but there was a note of genuine self-reflection in his voice. My sister says the same thing. Keanu replied with a small smile. Family has a way of keeping us honest. The floor manager approached cautiously. Mr. Smith, Mr. Reeves, we're back on air in 30 seconds. Will nodded acknowledgement but turned back to Keanu. Look, I'm hosting a small dinner next week at my place. Just a few industry friends talking shop, nothing fancy. I'd love for you to come continue this conversation. Keanu seemed surprised by the invitation but nodded. I'd like that. Thank you. The floor manager began the countdown. 5, 4, she mouthed. 3, 2, 1 silently, pointing to Jimmy as the red lights on the cameras lit up again. Welcome back, Jimmy said brightly to the camera. If you're just joining us, you missed one of the most incredible conversations we've ever had on this show with Will Smith and Keanu Reeves. Gentlemen, thank you again for being here. As Jimmy wrapped up the segment and prepared to introduce his next guest, a buzz was already spreading through the audience. People were pulling out their phones, social media lighting up with comments about what they'd just witnessed. Did you see that? A college student typed frantically to his roommate. Will Smith tried to call out Keanu Reeves on live TV and it turned into the most wholesome thing ever. Keanu Reeves just gave a masterclass in handling criticism with grace, a film professor tweeted. This should be required viewing for all my students. Within an hour, clips from the interview were trending online. By the next morning, they had gone viral, splashed across entertainment news websites with headlines like Unexpected Wisdom, Smith and Reeves share candid insights on acting, and How Keanu Reeves turned an awkward moment into television gold. But perhaps the most telling aftermath happened 3 days later, away from cameras and public scrutiny. In the private dining room of a small, unassuming restaurant in the hills, Will's promised dinner was underway. Around a simple wooden table sat a handful of actors and directors, engaged in lively conversation about their craft. Will and Keanu were seated next to each other, laughing over a story about a particularly disastrous special effect on one of Will's early films. So the wire snaps, Will was saying, gesturing expressively. And I'm supposed to be doing this heroic leap, but instead I just dropped like a stone right into the inflatable landing pad. Except I missed the center and bounced off like a pinball. The director was so concerned, but all I could do was laugh. The table erupted in laughter, Keanu among them. The initial tension from the talk show had completely dissolved, replaced by the easy camaraderie of fellow professionals who understood the unique challenges and absurdities of their shared profession. Later, as the evening wound down and guests began to depart, Will pulled Keanu aside. You know, that interview has had over 20 million views online now, he said. My kids' friends are quoting your line about being interested versus interesting. Keanu looked surprised. I hadn't realized. People are calling it a masterclass. In Grace Under Pressure, Will continued, and they're right. I came in with an agenda and you turned it into something meaningful. That's a rare gift, man. A waiter discreetly cleared dishes from the far end of the table, pretending not to eavesdrop on this conversation between two of the most famous men in Hollywood. The weird thing is, Will added, that episode's gotten the highest ratings of any show this season. My agent called yesterday with 3 new offers for joint projects, you and me together. Apparently people saw something in our dynamic. Keanu raised an eyebrow, amused. Are you suggesting that your attempt to shame me on national television was actually a brilliant career move for both of us? Will laughed, a full, genuine laugh that crinkled the corners of his eyes. Life's funny that way, isn't it? Sometimes our worst moments lead to unexpected opportunities. As they walked together toward the exit, a young busboy approached nervously, clutching a worn paperback book on acting. Excuse me, I'm sorry to bother you, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. But I'm studying acting at night school, and I saw your interview. It taught me more than a whole semester of classes. Would you mind signing my book? Both of you? Will and Keanu exchanged a glance, a moment of silent understanding passing between them. What had begun as an attempt to embarrass had transformed into a lesson that was now rippling outward, touching lives they would never even know about. As they took turns signing the young man's book and offering words of encouragement, the true impact of that unexpected television moment continued to spread, a reminder that sometimes Our most powerful teachings come not from our planned performances, but from how we respond when the script gets thrown away entirely.